even like working for governmental agencies. There's a lot of different types of research. Mostly MD-PhD graduates do either basic science or translational research. That's the great thing about getting the MD and the PhD. Translation is really kind of, it becomes your area of expertise, but there are also other types of research. So these are kind of where people go after getting an MD-PhD. And then, so there are a few flavors, I guess, of MD-PhD programs. So there's MSTP or NIH funded programs, and there are 45 of those in the US. For example, is the Harvard MIT program. And then there are some non-MSTP funded programs. So these ones will be internally funded by the schools that choose to host you for the MD and PhD portions. And then another option is the NIH Oxford Cambridge Scholars Program. So this is kind of very different from the other two programs in that you get to do part of your PhD at either Oxford or Cambridge. And it's really a good opportunity to get some international exposure, but it's more self-driven, and there are a few tracks for that. So just to kind of give you exposure to all of the different options that are out there. And then a bit of an application timeline. So you, in the year prior to the year that you want to start medical school, that's when the application starts. So in April and May, it's suggested to be asking for letters of rec, ensure that you're getting strong letters of rec. And then AMCAS, which is the application service, opens towards the end of May, start of June. And that's when you should submit your primary application. Being on time and doing things early is really important in this process. Following that, you'll receive secondary applications, which you should then try to submit within 2 to 3 weeks, but the MD-PhD students can talk about their own timelines a bit. And then there's interviews, and by mid-April or so, you must only hold 3 medical school acceptances, and by May 1st, you need to choose which medical school you'd like to go to.
So for the application component, we have a primary application and secondary application component. For the primary application, we usually have to report the coursework and the transcript. We also need to read the work in the work and activity section. We will able to entry like 15 up to 15 activity map, and and 3 of the activity will be the most meaningful, and we also need to explain like why we think that the activity are the most meaningful. For the letter of recommendation, we can submit up from 3 to 10 letter, and we can also assign which school that the letter can go to, and the letter can come from the committee in the school, the science faculty, research mentor, or physician scientist, and there are also 3 I think for the personal statement, MD-PhD justification, and then the significant research essay.
Yeah, and then so once you submit your primary application, then if you meet certain requirements that the school is looking for, then you will submit, then they will send you a secondary application to work on. And these secondary applications commonly have kind of an MD side and a PhD side for the MD-PhD program. The MD side is more like school specific. They want to see patient interactions. They want to know why you're interested in medicine, why you're interested in pursuing medicine at their school. They want to know a little bit more about your personal background. And then the PhD specific essays are for them to ensure that their school is a good fit for you, and that you can find people there that you would really be interested in working with, and kind of what projects you would be interested in working on, and seeing if that's a good fit there. And then, so paying for this application it's kind of expensive. it is expensive. So there is a double AMC fee assistance program that I would advise you to look into if that is something you're interested in. And then thinking about how many schools you're applying to also will affect the cost. So I guess being strategic in that regard can help with that side. Okay, so the first major essay that is going to go into the primary application is your personal statement. Some tips that we have for writing the personal statement is to think about what positive qualities you want to convey throughout your essay. So compassion, leadership, optimism, and then what specific experiences you have had that can show these qualities. And these don't always need to be physician related. They can be like a club that you're really invested in and how that impacted you. And then you need to relate all this back to your passion for medicine. So I was wondering if our panelists on the call can maybe talk about how they went about their personal statement and maybe any tips that they have.
I guess I can go first. I'll first preface by saying I think for me, the personal statement, like the why medicine question was actually the hardest because I tried not to overlap my why MD-PhD with my why medicine. And so for me, it took a lot of internal reflection to think about why medicine in isolation and trying to persuade, not necessarily persuade, but I guess reflect on my own experiences that have led me down that path to want to pursue medicine. And for me, I had two main things that that really inspired me to do medicine. And it was one, like my own experience with medicine. And in this case, for me, it was like, I was an athlete and I played sports, and in sports, it's common to get injured. And so with that, I kind of dealt with the experiences I felt, like the emotions I felt of fear, uncertainty with medicine, and then how it ultimately resolved quite quickly without much complication. But then I also paralleled that with another family member who was diagnosed with something that is not curable, and talking about the interesting aspects of medicine in both compartments, and how even when medicine like couldn't work out well, for instance, for my grandfather in this case, I still saw signs in the physician that left a very positive impact on people like my grandmother, on me, et cetera. And that really like instilled like the passion for me why I want to do medicine. Because I think a lot of times, especially like when you're pursuing MD-PhDs, a lot of people are pursuing an MD-PhD because there's a problem in medicine that's not solvable, or that's not solved yet. And so the question that comes down to, I guess, for me, or what it was for me, was like, why then do medicine in that field if it's not solved already? And for me, I saw with the experience of my grandfather is that although we don't have solutions yet for this, there was still a very vital role that the physician played in terms of caring for my grandfather, but also caring for my family members, because they're just as important as part of the care. They're just as important as the patient itself. And so my general tips was the personal statement. I don't think I can actually give the best advice for the personal statement because it was the hardest for me. But I really think like you should really reflect back on your own experiences, whether that's personal, but also maybe your experiences in the hospital or volunteering, et cetera, and really reflect on kind of like what qualities did you see in medicine or in that physician that you really wanted to take with you and hopefully provide to your future patients as well. And it really touched on why medicine is important to you. I think that's kind of ultimately how I looked at it. It did take me quite a long time to come to that internalization of it. But I think with time, I think you can really fizzle out your unique experience to why you want to do medicine itself.
I guess we can go next, or do you want to go, Jill? Or
you guys can go. Yeah,
okay.
Feel free.
Sure. So personally, for me, whenever I wrote my personal statement, so first of all, it's going to take like a ton of drafts, and sometimes the hardest thing is just like writing the first draft, because you want everything to be perfect, and so it can be hard to just like put your first thought on paper. But I think just like trying to come up with a list of all of the relevant experiences surrounding medicine, so like clinical experiences you might have, but also the non-clinical things that just remind you of medicine. So things that you think of like, oh, like, I don't know, when a team or something like that works together, that's similar to the way that medicine works together. And like, just kind of think about the things that remind you of medicine or themes of medicine that you find appealing. So I would say like one of the most appealing things for medicine for me was working with other people and working as a team to come to like a diagnosis of some kind or to care for a patient in more than one way. And I would say that I had always been involved in like for my personal story, I'd always been involved in teams, whether it was athletic teams like Trae or like musical teams. And so that was something that I homed in on. I was like, oh, this was something that was important to me. And I kind of like used that theme to tell my story. But I would say that like some things don't always work out that nicely. And it's also kind of nice to just find those moments of time where you thought, oh, this is a really cool thing. It made me feel XYZ. And that relates to, you know, why I want to do medicine.
Yeah, and so I kind of want to build on two things. So one thing that Trae had mentioned, one thing that Ryan had mentioned. And so it was this idea of like looking at the things that you see in the physicians that you've had a chance to interact with and in medicine and understanding how you can connect with those. And so what they both had mentioned a little bit is that this process takes a lot of time. And I think one thing that I realized going through that is that the process of writing these essays isn't necessarily just like taking the things that you've done and connecting them to what you see, but it's also a self-reflection and understanding process of going through why you did the things you did, why they're important to you, and what really makes you excited. Because what I ended up doing, and like looking back on it now, it was one of the best things I did, is through a lot of my experiences, I had this little composition notebook that I kept with me, and all the things that were super exciting, I wrote them down. The stuff that I felt I emotionally connected to, I wrote it down. And so when I came back to that, when I was writing this essay, I was able to reflect back upon those like really emotionally intense moments that I'd had shadowing, or that I had in writing some of the other essays too, like in the research side. And, you know, that's probably a little weird and nerdy, but it's fine. But like those were the types of connections that were super powerful to me. And then to be able to see that I was doing those in other student organizations that I was a part of, that I was doing things like mentorship, I was doing things like advocacy in those areas, and to see that connection there. And that I ended up already having those points to write about because I loved it. I loved that process of being able to be in all of those different areas, and to see that come to fruition from the reflection process was how my personal statement ended up getting laid out. And so I just think it's like so important for all of you as you go through this to really try to understand yourself as a person and where your motivations are coming from, and figure out how to put that onto paper. And I don't think that any single one of us is going to be able to tell you how to do that, because it's so individualized for every single one of us. And that's the biggest barrier to this, is knowing how to take the things that you get excited talking about and how to translate them onto paper in a way when somebody reads them, they can hear that coming from you.
Yeah, and also limit that to just the medicine side of
Yeah.
things, right? Because this is the personal statement, and then you have your MD-PhD statement, which are they have two slightly different, well, actually pretty different purposes, I would say. And you go about writing them in a different way, I'd say.
Yeah, I think to talk about my experience writing the personal statement, I also totally agree with Trae. It was definitely the hardest essay for me to write, because it's difficult when you're applying MD-PhD and you have an essay that says why MD-PhD, and you have an essay that says why are you interested in research, to talk exclusively about why you want to treat patients without also talking about the research aspect. And people approach it differently. I exclusively applied to MD-PhD programs, and so I didn't hide the fact that I wanted to be a physician scientist in my personal statement. But like everyone else on this call has said so far, the personal statement, the question that they're asking is why medicine? And so I think that's something that takes a lot of deep thought, because this is a field with a lot of gravity. You're directly responsible for people's lives. And I think I'm kind of in a unique position in my MD-PhD program, because I take a lot of classes with people who were studying medical engineering and medical physics, who actually thought about applying to MD-PhD programs, and then realized in trying to write the why medicine statement that treating patients was not what they wanted to do for their career. And they wanted to be involved with medicine, but they didn't want to be directly responsible for patient care. And that's really what the why medicine aspect is getting at, is why do you want to be a physician directly responsible for patient care? And it's a hard thing to put into words. And for me, I also had to do a lot of reflecting on, what was the crux of why I wanted to be a physician. And I talked a lot about many things Trae and Ryan and Miguel have talked or touched upon, and kind of combining the things that I love in life and the beauty and the magic I see in, the potential to treat patients. And that's really why I chose this path. I talked to that point a lot about communication, and I studied neuroscience and linguistics, and I grew up with someone who, my mom faced a lot of abuse in her life, and the way she interacts with the world is a consequence of how she was treated. And sometimes she has reactions to things that are hypervigilant or whatever. And growing up with her and seeing how she was an amazing mother to me shaped how, I viewed how special these interactions with people are, and just kind of talked about that in my personal statement of, I had a friend with cancer, and just he really was why I started exploring medicine in the first place. And then I started seeing a lot of people who, were like my mom in many ways, and were in a lot of pain in the hospital, and maybe had hard reactions to things that wouldn't be so scary if you weren't in a hospital setting, and just being able to sit with those big feelings and be with people in their worst moments. And I don't know, I think being in the hospital now too, it's like I reflect a lot on writing this personal statement, and I think it's really difficult to put into words, but yeah, I think the biggest thing is just to think about why you really want to treat patients, and think about sitting there with people in those big moments, and think about why you love this life, and how you want to be there for other people in their own.
Thank you so much, guys, for talking about that. I think that's very helpful for everyone attending.
Yeah, for the second writing is about it's the MD-PhD certification. So I think the important thing need to include that maybe talk about like your motivation for the reason you want to pursue the MD-PhD training, and how you envision your future career of science and medicine, and how the training will help you to achieve your career goal. And as well as you can mention about research direction that you want to follow in the future, and the research question that you want to answer, and how you can do that in the BD training to help you to, and the MD training to help you to answer the research question that you have. Yeah, I also want to any panelists able to share about your experience writing the MD-PhD certification?
Yeah, I can go first again. I'll first start off by saying that towards like the last 2 points, like the research direction you want to follow, the research questions you want to answer, I don't think you necessarily need to know or have that all figured out. I think that's a misconception. You don't necessarily need to even have the field figured out. I think more or less you just need to have the curiosity to drive to make translational efforts. For me, I personally had like a personal motivation to why I wanted to do MD-PhD, and I had a clear direction in what I wanted to do. But like I said before, that's not necessarily needed in the MD-PhD. I think what's really important in the MD-PhD essay is justifying why you want not just the MD, but also the PhD. What components of the MD training are going to make you a better scientist, and what components of the MD is going to make you, or what components of the PhD is going to make you a better doctor or something like that. And I would also like to say that this is the shortest essay you get. You only get like 3,000 characters. And so you're very, very limited in terms of the amount of space you have to compel that reason. And I think Ryan mentioned this earlier. I think one important thing that I like to do, or that I did for this case, was just write out my entire essay without a limit at all. Just write everything that came to mind of why I want to do the MD-PhD. And then later come back and reflect on each piece of that and start cutting back and then start creating a narrative. For me, that was the most effective way for me to completely consolidate my reasonings for why I want to do the MD-PhD, but also then turn that into a short little story. So that's the general purpose here, I would say, is that I think you'll commonly be asked this, especially during the interview trail as well, why not one or the other? Because as I mentioned before, you can be a PhD student or you can be a doctor and do research. So you don't necessarily need to have the PhD, and vice versa. You can be a scientist and do translational work without, treating patients. And so I think this question is fundamentally different than the why medicine. It's more or less to see why this training path specifically. And once again, I think a current theme throughout all the essays is this is going to take reflection on thinking about why you want one or the other, or why you need both. And then, taking that as long as your story, or maybe like some personal experiences, and turning that into a story. One more point I would add before I pass it on to the other panelists was some advice that I got from one of my mentors when I was applying last year, is to utilize the MD-PhD essay as like a small little story that I can use to branch off to for the other essays. For instance, as I mentioned before, this is MD-PhD essay, so I can kind of give a brief overview of why I want to do the MD-PhD pathway. And then once again, when I go to the why medicine essay, then I can talk into more depth about the MD portion of that. And then in the scientific research essay, I can not only show off my research experience, but also can then also justify why I want the PhD. And that's kind of how I looked at things. And that's what helped me throughout my process of writing the MD-PhD essay.
I guess we'll just maintain the order of things. No, that was great, Trae. I agree 100% with everything you said. And I think it's also challenging because I think you have to touch on this intersection that and you kind of make it your own and kind of talk about how that fits into your story, which is pretty challenging because I think there are only so many ways to say that, like, oh, I want to do this MD-PhD because I want to advance medicine, or like it's a lot of things tend to touch around similar themes. But I think one of the key things is like talking about your experiences and showing rather than telling. Like you don't just say one thing. And I would also say that like there are some people that have different motivations, and that you don't have to you also don't have to do like a pure science PhD either. Like there are anthropology PhDs, there are like history of science PhDs that you can do as well, that more like inform back on medicine and inform back on like patient experience. So it's pretty interesting. And I think I think the unique challenge of this paper was, again, the length. And I think it's always easier to cut the length of something, like just go ahead and write out as much as you want and then cut it down. I think that's easier than trying to like add stuff in. But yeah, I think this one should be about like why you want to do the whole thing. And there is a nuance in that though, like why, like Trae said, why you don't want to just do one or the other. And also there's like almost like a justification that you have to do of saying like, why couldn't you do what you're doing with just one, if that makes sense. So like, why couldn't you accomplish everything that you want to do with just doing an MD or just doing a PhD, which is kind of difficult.
Yeah, and I feel like that the justification for me, at least, more came up in the interview side of things. And I think it really came down for me to what Jill had mentioned about was that like being with people in vulnerable moments of life and in those like big, heavy emotional places where you get to be with that person in that, help them through that. That's something that doing a PhD alone, you're not going to have that in the same way. So that was like my justification, like big picture, if I had to give it in one sentence as to why. But I think like going through this whole essay as well, and I really liked what Trae had mentioned about kind of giving pieces to connect all of your essays together, because your application, and I think sometimes people try to fill out each experience as its own entity, and there needs to be fluidity between the pieces, and there needs to be pieces that help the reader understand as they're going through it. Okay, why did this push you to pursue one area? Why did it connect you to this thing? How did what you did influence your overall trajectory to where you're going to now? And in terms of like the MD-PhD portion itself, like Ryan had mentioned, really trying to focus this essay around giving little bits of those pieces, but really hammering on what are the unique pieces of the dual degree training pathway that you can't get doing either alone. And one of the things that I love talking about too was the protected time that I had to understand what my interests were in medicine as I got into this field. It's massive that I personally only had a small understanding of what was there, and going through that while having the time, those 4+ years to understand understand what research meant for me, how to understand how to synthesize ideas and tell stories, and how to start to wrap that with the medicine that we're learning. Whereas in going in either one of these pathways individually, you lose pieces on each side, or you don't have that type of protected time. You're trying to do a PhD's worth of learning and understanding of the scientific process in a fellowship. And so that was like where I kind of started to morph things together and tie some of my own personal threads into it, which was like representation in science and being able to be in both of these fields and push for people coming from my background, like farm towns in the middle of the Midwest, where this stuff wasn't known. No one told me that I could do this. And to be that person, to have an arm on both sides, to be able to exist in these areas, to be at the crux between them, but also at the same time to be able to help people that are coming from like my own backgrounds and those different from mine that don't have these types of opportunities, to be that person for them to say, hey, you have the ability and you deserve to be here, was one of the things that I wrapped into all of mine as well. And you start to pull those threads in, and that's from that reflection process. You find out those things that you're excited to think about, that you will lose sleep to go to all kinds of stuff to help other people and to do those things that you love. And so like that's where you pull those in.
Yeah, I think all awesome points. I'll try to, I don't know, talk about things that maybe haven't been touched on. Everybody is saying great things. One of the best pieces of advice I got in writing all of these essays is one of my advisors told me that there shouldn't be any sentence in your essay, in any of your 3 essays for the MD-PhD application process, that could have been written by somebody else. And I think it's very poignant because it's, you know, Ryan was talking about this. There are only so many ways that you can say why MD-PhD, why you want to be a doctor, et cetera. But there are infinite ways that you can make those sentences your own. And everybody, you know, is so beautifully unique in this world that I think it's just something to keep in mind, and really helped when I was doing exactly what Trae did for these essays, writing so, you know, as much as I could about the different prompts, and then just cutting back and cutting back and cutting back, and still making sure that I was able to keep my own voice running through everything I was saying. For the MD-PhD essay, I mentioned this with my personal statement, communication is something that's super important to me. And I think something that I talked about in the MD-PhD essay is I've been saying the word unique so much, but it's just such a niche community, you know? And as an MD-PhD, you have this wonderful opportunity to sit at, you know, the intersection between 2 worlds of science and medicine. And you hear this all the time between patients and the bench. But you're effectively a translator, a communicator between those worlds. And that role has so much power. And I saw this in the first lab that I was ever in. It was run by an MD-PhD, and his patients would come see the work that we were doing in the lab. And it's so special to see patients look at their own selves under the microscope, and just the beauty of that really spoke to me about the MD-PhD career path. And so that's something to keep in mind. And then just thinking about this essay too, like Trae mentioned, it is the shortest essay, and just really, you know, dive into that meaning of why you want to be a physician, why you want to be a scientist, and why you want to do both, because you can be a doctor and do research. And you also don't have to have your research direction defined. You can say, I want to be a physician scientist. And I think it's good to have a general idea, like I want to be a physician scientist, maybe in cardiology or something like that. But you don't have to say, like, I want to be a physician scientist who specifically works on PCSK9 mutations for people who have dyslipidemia, you know, like a little bit focused, but still open to change. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really like advice. Yeah, I think that the student will learn a lot from it and know like, oh, what is the theory that they should talk about, like, or not too detailed. Also, like in a way that like it helps with the to better identify what they should set in the also try in their MD-PhD writing. Oh, and I think third essay is either significant research. I think in this essay, they will ask the student to talk about the detail of their, like not really detail, but like deep dive about their significant research experience, maybe include like the thought process or to put something or what they learned from that significant research experience, and especially they include like the contribution and also the conference and the paper that that is the result from that research experience. Yeah, I also wonder like how do you drive about the your significant research essay?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, no, I mean, I would say that this one is the significant research essay is definitely more about telling your research story of whatever you did in undergrad, whatever you did, like basically everything that you've done in research and why you did it. But I think it's like people can get in the trap of just talking about the research, like just kind of listing everything out that they've ever done. And that's definitely the big trap about this, because this is the complete opposite of the MD-PhD one. It's the one where you have the most potential space, where you have the most space. So it's a different challenge, right? Because it's kind of hard to decide like how much is too much or what exactly to talk about, or I can always add more because this thing has like 10,000, whatever. I don't remember what the word limit was, but it was quite big. I would say this is something you should definitely sit down with your research mentor and like really talk about. You should also reflect a lot about what you learned going through every single small part, like every failed thing that you did. I think failures are important to like acknowledge, and like negative data is also important to acknowledge, and acknowledge the importance of those steps and what you learned from like projects going down rabbit holes or going down different things. Just talk about like the development of everything. And also, I don't think there's a problem with saying like that other people contributed to your stuff. Like, I don't think you have to focus only on your contributions. I think that it's a good thing to say like, oh, I built on this thing that someone else did, or like that I learned how to ask for help on these things, or I collaborated with this group or that group, because I think that's actually a key of being an MD PhD. Like you have limited time, and like, yeah, exactly. Like no one's going to get here alone. And I think that also like, you should also especially recognize that as an MD PhD, you'll have to make collaborations. You're going to like have to communicate with two very different spheres. You're not going to be able to do it all extremely well. So it's important to recognize your limits and be able to connect with other people. So I think that's an important thing to touch on. If not in this essay, then certainly in others. Because I do remember this essay being a little bit less like, I remember getting advice that this essay was a little bit less about explaining every experience and how you felt about everything. This one is a bit more like, tell us more what you did, but I think there's a lot of room to say why you did what you did, for sure.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I feel like one common thing that you see people do when they're first starting to go through this is it ends up being an essay of abstracts and then connected abstracts. And so really, I think what made this come to life for me personally was telling my own personal research story and how my interests started, how they grew over time, how I grew as a scientist, the things that I learned, how I learned to collaborate, how I learned to bounce back from failure, how I went from not knowing literally anything to like being able to present a poster and what that meant for me, how I grew from that, how it pushed me to go to summer programs, to go for 2 years as a postbac program when I was in prep, to do those types of things, and that thought process of why was I going through each step? How did it help me mature as a scientist? And then why did it push me to do the next thing that I did? And then how has that shaped me where I am now? You have an opportunity with all of these characters to use maybe half of those characters to talk about whatever protein you're working on or pathway or whatever cool psychology experimentation you've been running in whatever lab. But I think the bigger point of it is they want to see, have you taken that time, just like with these last two essays, to step back, to understand where you started, where you're at now, how each thing helped influence you to who you become, and then also to project forward to who you want to be. And I agree with everyone that's talked about this before, is you don't need to know exactly what you want to do. And I think that that is something that people often think that they need to know. Because I remember too, when I was going through like interviews and would get asked that questions, and I still truly believe this, I don't think the point of doing a PhD is for us to find the one thing we're going to work on for the rest of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
The point of doing the PhD is to understand the process of science, how to ask the questions, how to find the gaps, how to push things forward, and how to think creatively within a system like the, you know, all the grants and stuff we have to do. And so to get to that point though, was going through that process of understanding all the pieces and how each one pushed me over time.
Yeah, I would say that don't get in the trap of thinking that the significant part of this significant research essay means like, oh, what are all of the most important things that you did? What are all of the flashy science things that you did? That's not the point. I think the significant part of it is like, what did it mean to you, and how has it shaped who you are as a scientist?
Yeah.
And what will you be in our PhD phase, and what do you value as a scientist too?
Yeah, and I think like, because everyone applying to these programs is going to have done research. There's going to be people that have like so many things that you're going to think, how have they lived any type of life up until now? But I think honestly, what my experience where I clicked with interviewers and programs was in showing and having that conversation that I understood as much as I could from where I was at on the outside of what it meant to go down this path, as opposed to having 15 publications and 5 grants and 10 programs or whatever the case may be, is having that understanding.
Yeah, I think both of you made stellar points. The significant research thing, definitely don't harp on the significant in terms of, you know, what is the most prestigious research you did or whatever. I had no publications coming into my MD-PhD program. So also people who tell you that you need to have 5 publications in Nature or whatever, it's just straight up not true. It is just not true. And the thing that they want to see in this essay is exactly what Ryan and Miguel were talking about. Application readers want to see that research matters to you, and that the research you did matters to you, and that you want to do research that matters to you and that matters to you and patients in the future. And I think this essay, more than the others, there are a million ways you could write it. Some people write it more in like bullet form, some people write it in paragraph form, some people write it in a story. I wrote it in kind of like mini stories, I guess, because I worked at a few different institutions in undergrad and did a few different research programs, and also had some mostly basic science, but a lot of translational and some social science projects as well. And so I had 2 major experiences in labs that I both worked in for 2 years in my junior and senior years of college, and then in my gap year. So those were my 2 biggest sections of the essay. So I would say they collectively took up 80% of the significant research experience essay for me. And then I had like little headers, and I wrote it in paragraph form. And then the last paragraph, I talked about the things that connected research to humanity for me. And so it wasn't just, you know, looking at mitochondria under the microscope, but I also did a lot of research I really care about on the language we use with patients, and particularly with cancer patients, and looking at the metaphors we use for cancer and whether that's helpful for people, and how kids perceive them, because I really care about kids and their experience in the hospital. And all of that was as significant to me as the research that is often seen, unfortunately, as more prestigious. I think all research is valuable. And some people told me to take the social science stuff out of my essay, but any social scientists on the call, you are so valued and so worthy of this kind of experience. And we really need more social scientists. And so please don't just focus your significant research experience essay on the things that look the flashiest. They really should be the things that matter the most to you. Yeah, just tell your story all throughout this essay also, and make sure your voice is still there.
Yeah, I'll finish. I'll keep my points pretty short because what everybody said already is basically what I did. But what's really important, I think, what Miguel was saying as well, you don't want to turn this into an abstract to another abstract to another abstract. I think that's pretty, imagine being the reader, like that's boring. but also imagine being the reader that's not an expert in your field is what I also add. So you got to be careful. There's got to be a balance to the depth you go into your writing about this particular project you did, because not everybody that's going to read your project is an expert on the mTOR pathway, et cetera. So if you go into the nitty gritty about it, they're going to get lost, they're going to get bored. There's nothing memorable from this besides that you just told me an extreme amount of facts, that there's nothing I can take away from that. So you got to have a balance here. Know your audience, know that everybody that you're talking to is not going to be necessarily an expert in your field, but they're not also going to be completely naive either and not know anything either. So have that nice balance throughout each of your research experiences that you talk about in there. And I think it's really important here as well to connect each research experience to each other if you could. For instance, for me, like when I first started doing research my freshman year, you can expect that I did not know anything that I was doing. I was following orders. I was learning kind of what research is about, failing a ton, which is really important. I talked about that a lot in my research essay as well, saying, I learned failure is a vital part of research. I learned that also just because my hypothesis was proven wrong doesn't mean I didn't learn something. That's new data that we just contributed to the world. And so I think it's really important that you can make a narrative out of anything and tell your story, like Jill said. It comes down to, once again, I guess, reflection here and thinking about each individual experience and what you learned from each one. So for me, I started from like my first experience where I knew nothing about research. I followed someone's orders. And then towards the end of my college career, I was quite independent. And I talked more at length on kind of the differences in my thought process about why I was asking this question, why I was going to use this method over another method, et cetera. Another thing that I think is very important here is if you can show off that you did some independent work, it's very important that you do that in this case, to show off that you weren't necessarily just following orders all the time. Because I think when you are independently running a project, you really get to experience what it's going to be like as a grad student. Because as a grad student, you're not going to necessarily follow what the PI tells you all the time. You're going to have to figure it out on your own a little bit. That's the whole part of the process of becoming an independent scientist. And so I was somewhat vulnerable in those moments, and I talked about that openly in my essays. And so, like I said before, I don't think you should treat this essay as, abstract to abstract. I think you should add some flavor to it. Talk about kind of the lessons you learned from each experiment. And then also, like, if you can, tie them to each other. You don't have to be a rocket scientist at the end of this. You don't have to be the greatest scientist coming out of college. That's not the point. The point is for you to show that you have an interest in research. You experience research to a somewhat of a decent depth that you can say validly that you want to do the PhD. And then the PhD is the part of your training where you actually will become really an independent scientist. So don't feel like you need to have an extreme amount of experience and really portray that in the essays, because they're not expecting that. And so that's all I'll add to this as well.
Yeah, I totally don't read that like the significant research we should see that like how the different research like change our how we develop, like how we change our perspective, and also like and the research is like more like meaningful for like personally. It do not need to like come from any need to be like come from a really well known school or place. So yeah.
Oh, another quick point that I just thought of is don't shy away from the word we in the significant research experience essay. This kind of gets at a point that both Trae and Ryan, and I think Miguel also, everybody brought up, is every experience builds off of the other. And we work with a lot of people when we're starting out in research. And so I think I was kind of under the impression that the significant research experience essay needed to be about stuff I directly did, but there's so much that you can use the word we for. And I think it's also really important to show humility and stuff.
Okay, so these are some tips. Quick disclaimer, this has like hour numbers on here. Maybe these are things to shoot for, but as all of the panelists have mentioned, it's a lot about the experience and how these things have impacted you. So it's not necessarily about getting a certain number of hours or anything. It's about doing something that's meaningful to you, being able to reflect on that, and then being able to show that later and have it drive you in your career. So these are just kind of some recommendations that actually were provided in an NIH workshop in terms of research. So just having like either multiple years at your university in the lab or doing like a few summer experiences Also having potentially different lab experiences could be beneficial. In terms of clinical experience, showing that you have shadowed, that kind of drives your personal statement, why you want to be working in the clinic, why you want to be working with patients, how you can see yourself contributing. And then leadership and volunteering, community service is a really good way to show that. Maybe if there's some organizations you're currently involved in, what are you doing there? Yeah, okay. And Jill makes a really good point. So because you're doing an MD-PhD, definitely the research side is important. So it's more about the experiences that you've gotten out of your out of clinical. So you don't need like 100 hours or something. Yeah. So Trae as well. Yeah, so also another tip, something that at least I found really helpful was getting the MSAR from AAMC. It helps you see kind of the different medical schools, how expensive they are, what their rankings, I guess how many people they accept in state, out of state. It can help you kind of choose what medical schools you may be interested in applying to. But I was wondering if our panelists could talk really briefly about like gap years, if you guys have done gap years, how many you did, and how many schools you applied to, and how you chose to apply to those schools.
I guess I can go quickly. I took one gap year, highly recommend gap years. I loved my gap year. I also had my gap year in the first year of COVID, so everything was pretty nuts, and it was just so nice to have a sense of stability in the chaos of everything. And I also will say, for the sake of transparency, I applied to 23 programs. I exclusively applied to MSTPs, and that was the advice I got from my undergrad, that undergrads from Duke, the average number of medical schools is 23. And you just never know what's going to happen in the application cycle. I could have applied to fewer. I just didn't know that going in. And also, for the sake of transparency, my applications cost me almost $5,000. And I'm financially independent. And so that meant that I had to take a gap year to fund that. And so that's something I wasn't aware of before I went into this application process. This process is insanely expensive. It would be a whole nother Zoom call to talk about it. But yeah, that's my experience.
Yeah, so I also did gap years. I did 2 gap years, and I did a prep program. So it's like, I'm sure most people here have heard of ERDA. If you haven't heard of ERDA, it's like a post-bac program at the NIH, but the NIH also sponsors grants at other institutions that are known as PrEP, or post-baccalaureate research education programs, that are built for students coming from underrepresented backgrounds in medicine. And so a lot of times they're built for people that want to go to PhDs, but a lot of them now have slots for MD-PhD applicants. And it was an extremely great program because I got essentially 2 full years of straight research. It had funding, but I also was able to go to workshops while I was there on how to do things like Illustrator, how to do 1 minute versus 5 minute versus 20-minute talks and posters. And you get a lot of like training in that regard. The programs a lot of times have like MCAT preparation wrapped into them. They have funding for conferences. And so it's a lot of like helping to boost you up to get you ready to go through these types of things. And it was an extremely great experience. I think that those 2 years were the difference for me in understanding why I wanted to do this and how I could articulate that well and why I'm here.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah, I also was going to say in the chat that, yes, the state bias is definitely not a thing. So like, for example, UT Long or like Texas medical schools, there's like, they have like a requirement, the state medical schools have a requirement actually that 90% of their class be in state residence. So only like 10% can be out of state, like for MD programs, but for the MD-PhD, it's completely not true at all. Like I think there have been years that like some of the Texas ones have been like almost exclusively out of state. So just to clarify that, I was going to type it, but my key, like I said before, my keyboard is trash. So.
I'll add about the gap years. I did 1 gap year as well. I also did prep. And so I guess for timeline wise, like I was applying while I was starting my prep program. But I used my prep program as so first off, I did research at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. which was close to home for me. I didn't really want to go far from home for a year. But I also strategically chose this program and chose a lab for a particular reason. And so I chose a MD-PhD lab. Who was a neurologist who also was doing research in Alzheimer's disease research, drug development, which is exactly what I wanted to do. Not saying this is going to be the case for everybody, but it was the case for me. And I used it for a personal reason to see, would I actually like this lifestyle? Do I actually like that research? Do I actually want to do this entirely? And if that's the case, I actually found out really quickly when I was there. I was like, I really do love this, as I thought I did. And then I could talk about that later on into my secondary applications, or during interviews. I really talked about it a lot. Talked about how I really got to envision what my future can look like, and I want to do that. So it worked out great for me that I had that unique experience to be in a lab of MD-PhD. I also come from a school. I didn't mention this in my intro. I went to Kennesaw State University for my undergrad in Georgia. It's not a super well-known school, but one unique fact about my school is we don't have PhDs and there's not much research opportunities. And so it was another opportunity for me to expand my research interest and really see other research that's out there. Obviously, some research programs is another tool for that, which I did take advantage of as well. But, I think these are other things that I thought were weaknesses in my application. I don't think they actually were in retrospect, but for me, that's I was just covering my grounds, but also exploring my own interests and making sure that what I was about to get myself into was correct. I applied to 24, 25 schools. And I think, like Joe said, this is it's ridiculously how expensive it is. I think I also spent around $4 to $5 grand entirely. I honestly think secondary applications is literally just a cash grab. That's a conversation for another, like Joe said, I think this is a conversation for another Zoom call. I think secondaries are honestly ridiculous. But I think the golden number of schools you apply to, I think it's kind of independent to each person, especially your financial standpoint. And so really take that into consideration. Apply broadly. I think applying to MD-PhDs is a crapshoot. I've helped other students apply this cycle that I've thought their applications are hands down absolutely perfect, and some of them are struggling, some are doing phenomenally well, and that's just how it goes. I think it's just it's a crapshoot. You never know what's going to happen. So apply broadly, apply within your means financially, and go from there. In retrospect, for me, I applied to 24, 25 schools, and it was too much. So I actually ended up withdrawing from a lot of schools pre-decisions or anything like that. But I would never have known that in the beginning of the application. So for me, I chose to apply to those schools because I wanted to, and I had the financial means. I saved up for it. But also, I would only add this final point is saying, don't apply to school just to apply to a school. I think you should also somewhat vet that school a little bit, because if that's the only school you get into, you want to make sure you're at least going to be somewhat happier there, and so at least can fulfill the training that you want to get out of it. So very much vet that first. Don't just apply to school just to apply to school to add your numbers up. Make sure you look at school a little bit. And throughout the process, you'll really learn more about schools. For me personally, I thought schools that were really high on my list ended up being pretty low on my list after I learned more about them, and vice versa. So take that all into consideration throughout the process. Everybody has a unique process with this as well.
Yeah, and then just to piggyback on that a little bit. So I did the exact same thing that Trae and Jill did in my post-bac program. I sought out a physician scientist to work with to go through that same process of learning what it would be like. And then also just to comment as well, I know Jill had mentioned it in the chat, Varun, about international students. I know for the majority of the MSCP specific grants, one of the criteria is you have to be a US citizen to be able to be funded by the grant. But that being said, a lot of institutions like Emory, WashU, and Penn have additional slots for international students. And so that's something that you probably have to go onto the websites to go look at and to try to identify whether or not they do have those spots that are available, or reach out to programs. Because I don't know for sure off the top of my head if there's a database or something that exists to tell you that, but that does exist at a lot of schools.
It's challenging, yeah. And I think so I think biotech is, depending what you're doing in biotech, it could be research as well, to one question that just popped in the chat. So if you're doing industry work, it could be, I know we're running over time, but
yeah, Ryan, is it okay if we take a little break? We'll get through our presentation and then let's
yeah, sure.
questions after. Okay. Just in case people have to leave at 9 or around that time. So we'll just get through the presentation and then can continue.
Yeah, and this we want to talk about like what do the admission committee look for. I think the MD-PhD admission committee do a holistic review, and about, as other panelists also mentioned, that they want to know more about your like motivation, like to see the career commitment, and also they want to a substantial research experience, but it's not in the mean of the hour, but like of the research experience, at how do you start to learn more about the research and how to like how is he as a scientist, and also they also look, I think that is about academic success, but it not to be like need to be like really like like for some people I think that they have the thinking about like like to apply for MD-PhD, or that it has to be like find trendy like MCAT or something like that, or like the really high GPA. I think that like they want to see like the like you hard work and something like that, but not really, and I think that like they also consider other aspect of the applicant, and also they also want to see the character of the of applicant, like if the applicant independent, mature, or and they able to collaborate with other, and also life experience, and then the clinical experience and community service. Yeah. You want the Benedict have anything to share about it?
Yeah, so before we get to the Q&A, I know we're a little bit over time. I just wanted to put a form in the chat for all of the participants to fill out. Just like let us know what you thought about the webinar, and also we're recording this so we can send a recording to you if you're interested. And once you fill out that form, then yeah, we can just open it to Q&A, and maybe around 9:30 or whenever people want to leave. So yeah. Okay. So some questions have been answered in the chat. Tian, should we move to Q&A then? Or okay. Okay, let's look at. Ooh, okay. So Ari has a really good question. Have you had like PIs discourage you from doing an MD-PhD because the PhD during the MD-PhD is like a fake PhD or not a real PhD, or like people telling you, oh, you'll do an MD-PhD and then you'll just become a physician or something like that? So how have you gone about that? And also a follow-up question is, how do you see yourself kind of splitting your time between your clinical work and your research as a physician scientist?
Yeah, I'll brutally say yes. I think multiple people along your trail will tell you that you can't do something, and I think honestly, screw them. I think if it's something you're very passionate about, do it. I think it's also it's a unique challenge as well for people of underrepresented minority backgrounds like myself. I mean, I've been specifically told from high school, middle school, that people that look like me can't do this. Even my PI, I guess going back to the question of interest, my PI told me during my senior year that he didn't think I could actually do this pathway, or called me a wannabe MD-PhD, because he really thought this is unique. This is really unique, but like he was like, grew up in the PhD system of the UK. And so he never really believed in the MD-PhD pathway, because I don't think they really have that there. And so his philosophy is that I should do a PhD first and then do MD. So like the moral of the story is, like, throughout your career, multiple people are going to tell you that you can't do this for X, Y, and Z reasons. I think if this is something you really want to do, then do it. Like, I think honestly, screw the people that say that you can't do this, because honestly, I think they're really envisioning that in themselves that they couldn't do this versus you can't doing this. And just think back to like why you want to do it in the first place. I thought about why I want to do it in the first place, and that's kept me going ever since. But also, like I said before, I recognize going forward, this is not going to be an easy road. I know multiple people going forward that I'm going to meet are going to tell me that I can't do this. Some people in your life, on the other hand, though, will support you and really will push you to do this. I've had many great mentors that I've talked to them openly about this, and they're like, I don't know where they're coming from because I see a million great things in you and you could totally do this. And so that's, once again, just to stop being a broken record. Multiple people are going to tell you can't do this. Hopefully multiple people are going to tell you that you can do this. At least I will be one of those people that will tell you that you can do this. And so if this is something that you're passionate about, then go for it. You should definitely do it. And so forth. I'll just leave it to the first question, and other people can answer the second question and stuff like that.
Yeah, totally agree with Trae. I think one thing I would add is just thinking about what you really want to do. And if you're thinking about PhD versus MD-PhD, just touching back to some points earlier in our conversation about, do you want to take care of patients? Because it's a huge distinguishing factor between MD-PhD and PhD, because you can be a really clinically oriented PhD, like my PI for my PhD, for example, but not directly treat patients and have an equally fulfilling career. It's really just coming down to what you want to do. So I'll answer the next one about my clinical experiences. So I think all of our answers are going to be a bit weird because we all were part of the COVID class in some capacity, and clinical experiences obviously were very different than before. I had I want to say I had 50 to 70 hours of shadowing, mostly in pediatric neuro-oncology and other pediatric specialties, both at WashU and at Duke. I was a child life volunteer, so I played with kids in the playroom at Duke Children's Hospital for a year, and I would go every Tuesday. I would play music at a local nursing home in Durham a few Saturdays every semester in college. And then I did an MD-PhD summer program that kind of exposed me to MD-PhDs. And and that was totally fine for the MD-PhD application process. And I was able to meet patients and be really impacted by them and hear their stories that way.
Yeah, so we wanted to try and tackle a few of the other ones. You guys are asking like super good in-depth questions. So this was from Varun about our applicants at a statistical advantage by not coming from Ivy League schools. Okay, so I went to Ohio State. I did not go to like a crazy school, but I like vividly remember going into these interviews and I was the only kid from a state school, or I would be the only kid from a state school and there would be one other kid from a small like liberal arts college. And it was very intimidating, but it does not disadvantage you at all. And I think what the big difference is like at those bigger institutions, bigger like the ones you had mentioned, like Hopkins or WashU, St. Louis or whatever, is that I think that this pathway is seen as something that's more accessible. It's something that's more known about. It's something that's pushed a little bit harder than it is at somewhere like Ohio State, and Ryan can give his perspective on Texas A&M as well. But it's like, it does not put you in a disadvantage at all. I just think because of the schools that we came from, it's not something that's known about. And to kind of piggyback on the one that was slightly far down in terms of like, did you want to do MD versus both first? I only wanted to do MD when I first came in because I literally did not know research existed. Like I grew up in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. The only thing that I thought I could do as a scientist was only thing I could do in science rather was to be a physician. I didn't know what research was. When they told me that in the first pre-med club I went to, like I had no idea what it meant. And then I got lucky and like serendipitously found a PI who was amazing, who literally, we were talking one day and I was like, oh, the stuff we're doing is cool, but I've always wanted to do medicine. He told me that this pathway existed and like my mouth literally fell open. Like this is a thing. And it's like that exposure was the difference for me. And then over time from those experiences, I figured out my own reasons for wanting to do MD, why I wanted to do PhD, and then why both was the right thing for me in the end.
Yeah, I would definitely second everything that Miguel said. And then, so I went to Texas A&M University. I didn't even do like a summer thing away from Texas. Everything that I did, all the research, all the experiences I had were in a small Texas town. So yeah, I mean, you're not at I would say, yeah, statistically, you can look at it and you can see that, oh, there's this distribution of schools, everybody that's going into these programs. There's like so many from Harvard and Duke and Wash U and Stanford and all that stuff. But don't let that intimidate you, because I think that's more of like an information paucity. Like I would say that like there's less information about MD-PhD programs at state schools. I think like they'll tell you there's like good pipelines set up for pre-meds, I think, but there's not great pipelines set up for physician scientists and like the MD-PhD pathway. So I would say that like definitely don't let that discourage you. I wouldn't say you're at a statistical disadvantage. I would also say that like, yeah, I would definitely say no for that.
Yeah, because like I remember too, I went to the pre-med office at Ohio State and told them I wanted to go down the physician scientist pathway, and they literally didn't know what to do.
Yeah, some of them don't know what to do at all.
And if there are any of you in that situation, please look into things like APSA, the American Physician Scientists Association. They do webinars for students to teach you about what it means to go down this pathway. There are students like Brianna Christopher's, the Tri-I program at Cornell, who has like an entire website dedicated to pre-med resources on going down this pathway, on connecting you to mentors. APSA has an entire mentorship thing set up so that you can get those critical pieces that are able to help you understand what this means and how to get there.
Yeah. I don't remember what I was going to say. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think I was going to answer, I think, Camille's question, which was about whether you want to be a PI, but it looks like Jill is answering some of those. So.
Yeah, I'm just randomly answering questions. So feel free to answer whatever. Miguel.
Well, so Sydney asked a question. She said she's trying to make a school list, having a hard time differentiating MSTPs from each other and deciding which would be a good fit. So when you guys found like a few MSTPs that were interesting, how did you decide which ones to actually apply for, and which ones did you decide worked best for you in the end?
Yeah, so I was going to answer Sydney's question directly. What I first did, like when I made like my primary list, I mainly looked at location first. I think that's really important to look at. Actually, it's really important in retrospect, the location of where you go to school. And I knew like certain schools in certain areas, not that they were a bad program by any means. It's just like, I knew for a fact I didn't want to live there. Like think about family, think about, distance from home. All those stuff are actually really important. And I think sometimes people put that in the back burner, but I think it's really important to think about that. And you want to place yourself in an environment that if you're going to be there for 7 to 8 years, you can hopefully have a good quality of life. So that was like one of the first things I did. But also the second thing I did is just make sure like they had some form of like research that was similar to what I wanted to do. And I understand that not every single program is going to have this exact niche thing that I want to do, but certain programs have their own niches or own programs for that reason that are close to that. So I think those are the two main things I looked at when I was initially making my list of schools. And then, like I said before, I think once you go along the trail, once you interview and meet the programs, they'll tell you more about their programs. And if you're lucky enough to get in, then you get to go to second look and you really get to start asking the hard questions to not only the program directors, but also to the current students. That's when I really started to see like, this school I thought I liked a lot, I actually don't really like that much, versus this school I didn't actually put too highly on my list is literally like the top school on my list now. Like that's how some of these things go. You'll meet also amazing people. That's kind of hard though to make a decision based off that. I wouldn't say that. That's just a point to add though, is like you'll meet so many amazing people. You'll learn so many different things about schools once you're in the process. I think in your initial list, focus on like the bigger things. Like if you know for a fact you're not gonna like want to live in like, I don't know, Idaho. Sorry for anybody that's from Idaho on the call, but like if that's the case, like you don't want to live there, then don't apply to a school that's in Idaho. Like that's kind of how I did it at first. And like I said, hopefully they have the research opportunities that you're looking for as well.
Yeah, and I would just to echo that too. I think like say for if you want to do like X-ray crystallography and you apply to a program that doesn't have X-ray crystallography PIs, that's not a good match. And so like you have to try to match yourself to the programs, because the programs, since they have few spots, they're trying to also find people that match them. That's in terms of the research, that's in terms of the environment. And so some of the schools that are a little more isolated are going to go after people that have connections to those areas, that want to specifically be in those areas. Like Michigan was a big one for me. me, since I was from the Midwest, I spent time in Michigan during my gap years. A lot of people at like the Michigan interviews and second looks and things like that, they either had parents in Michigan, they had connections to Michigan, they wanted to live there for specific reasons. And I think that those things, and it doesn't have to be like locationally, but if you are a good fit for a school based on research, if you're a good fit for a school based on the types of things that they believe in, the types of organizations they have, the types of environments you want to be in, the types of patient populations you want to serve, and the people that you want to care for during your training, those are the things that you build the bigger picture, which helps you tell them that you're a great fit for their program.
Hey, Joseph, a fellow Aggie in the chat. I love it. So I would say, yeah, so for as far as like a minimum MCAT, I think that's very tricky. And I would discourage you from like trying to reach a certain score. I mean, I would say that, yeah, there probably is some kind of bar. I think it depends where you want to go. You want to be close to the average ideally, but I think there's so much leeway, especially with MSTPs and MD-PhDs, is because it's more about like how you talk about research and all of those things. Again, publications, they're not required. I think I don't think I even had one whenever I first applied either. I had been to like a couple conferences and that was it. So, but as far as the MCAT goes, I think, what would you say is the minimum?
I don't know.
For like an MSTP, I guess maybe a 512, but it depends it depends on so many different things. If you had like a massive research experience, that's going to outweigh your like MCAT, I think, at a lot of levels, I feel like. So I don't know. I think it depends where you want to go. I think some programs value it more than others, even if they're not willing to explicitly say it. So I think it's challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna add. I was gonna say. Well, first off, I didn't have like a 520 plus MCAT. And I guess I'm at like a really high school that has really high MCAT scores. Like I think MSAR, for instance, that is mostly off MD data, by the way. So I think that's like the MCAT scores are mostly off MD. So that's a completely different ball game. Like Ryan was saying, MD-PhDs look at it a lot more, I think, and I think research is really more important than your MCAT score. I think obviously there's a certain threshold, but like let's say you're at like a 513, 514, I think you're still in the running for top schools. I think some of the higher schools might like discriminate more on that. But at the end of the day, I think like as long as you score decently well on it, I don't think that should be a limiting factor. I know personally when I was applying, I was like, dang, I'm like not even close to like the median here for some of the like the upper echelon schools. It didn't have a problem for me. And I think it's just because of my application entirely, not just because of my MCAT score. And also just to answer another question, I think someone asked about REU's experience or summer research experiences. I only did one because of obviously the pandemic. I don't think you necessarily need to do like X, Y, and Z amounts. I think they're more for your own benefit to expand your research horizon. You can stay at your own school. What most schools really want to see is just longitudinal research experience in the first place. And I think some research opportunities are great for people that come from institutions that don't have many opportunities for that, but also for those that, like, for instance, like I came from a school that had very limited opportunities. So I got to go explore my own interests and stuff like that. So I don't think there's like necessarily a requirement of how many REUs you should do. I don't even think you need to do it on REU or a gap year, for instance. I think what comes down to the research side of it is just like you had some form of longitudinal research experience that you can talk to at a good depth. And I would highly encourage to do conferences, to give talks, like poster talks, oral talks. It's honestly a practice of talking to someone that's either an expert or not an expert in your field, because that's what you'll do when you write your essays. That you will literally do this in every single interview. They'll ask you, tell me about your research. It's basically the same concept all over again. And so it's basically practice, and you really want to build that skill, because that's also an important thing as a scientist is you want to be able to, it's all cool and all that you just figured this out, but like if you can't tell someone like why is it so important and kind of what does it mean in layman terms, it's not going to be implemented. So it's a really important skill to learn how to present your research. So I would also highly recommend doing conferences if you can.
Yeah, and I was like the same exact way that Trae was. I was not a 520 plus person. When I was setting applications, I was like, all right, I'm at the bottom of this range, but let's let it rip and see what flies at the end. And it ended up working out super well because of that holistic process. And just to give a tidbit about summer programs too, I totally agree with everything Trae said. I just wanted to give the plug that there are like MD, PhD focused summer programs that do exist at quite a few schools. And especially if you're on the call and you're earlier on in this process, and I would look into those, because if that's something you're interested in. They're super awesome experiences. Like I know, Gateways at Cornell has one, Michigan has one, Vanderbilt has one, Wisconsin has one, and there's like a compiled list that exists online too to look at those types of things.
Yeah, Gateways is a huge one, especially if you're like underrepresented in medicine or you fit that demographic and like you're looking for something with like a cohort of people that share similar interests and reaching those populations. That's like pretty big. Oh, and Harvard, it looks like Harvard has one now too.
Oh yeah, so actually,
Yeah,
I remember them mentioning that too. Yeah, this past year. That's cool. Awesome. So Harvard has one too. So yeah, if you haven't started, or like if you're like, how early can you do that, Jill? I think like you have to be a sophomore for Gateways. I don't know.
I think it's freshman, sophomore for Gateway. Some of the other ones are older. Like I did the Michigan one, and I think it's junior, senior.
Yeah,
for Michigan,
but it's cool. I mean, try those out.
Yeah,
yeah,
cool.
Harvard, we only are able to take 6 students because it's our first year this summer, and we've already admitted the first class. Their sophomores and juniors are people who are going into their junior and senior year of college, but in future years, we're going to try to take people of all ages in college. So definitely stay on the lookout, and we're hoping to expand our program.
Love that. Yeah, that's awesome. Are there any other
so we have to wrap up at 9:30 actually. So I just wanted to say thank you so much to our panelists for coming and speaking today, sharing your experiences. This has been very valuable and we really appreciate your time. I'm going to put the link to the Google form one more time in the chat for anybody who might have not filled it out so far. Again, thank you so much. And we look forward to helping you guys further with your MD-PhD application journey and with hosting other webinars. So thank you, panelists. Thank you, people who came. So.